welcome everybody to our final presentation. We are Synthetic Alliance Studios. I'm Philip Gallen. I am one of the co-leads for the project as well as a game designer for our game.
I'm Ben Shutt. I'm another project co-lead. I'm also the programmer and web developer.
I'm Eric Franklin. I work with the art as well as building the models and the animations.
And I'm Abby Getzloff, and I worked on 2D and 3D art for the project.
Okay. And we would also like to thank Dr. Whittinghill for being our project sponsor for this project. Anything to do, let's jump right into it. All right, before we get into all the meat and bones of the presentation, I'd like to quickly go over what to expect. So I'm going to briefly introduce our project and our product, and we'll jump right into artificial intelligence, which is one of the major variables in our study, and then we'll also go into player immersion right after that. After that, we'll quickly go over our product and all features of our product and why it's important. We'll go over the methodology of how we used it for our study, how we are testing, and like all the results we're going to get from our project. And we'll go over those results as well, and any other assumptions and future studies from our perspective and why it's important. And then we'll conclude our presentation from there. All right, so I'm going to ask a rhetorical question. How many of you have ever gotten very frustrated with a game? Many of us, right? Maybe in cases you sometimes look like this, or like this, or this maybe. Maybe sometimes it's not always that frustrating to play a game, right? Sometimes you're just so into it, like this, or like this. All of these cases have one thing in common. They are all immersed in the game. They are all experiencing some level of player engagement. And that's what's important for us. Well, so what? Basically, there are many factors in video games that could help determine whether an experience is positive or negative. Stuff like, I don't know, a positive experience, a factor that could work into that would be something like graphics. That could really pull you in. And then there's also negative experiences that could form from that. And like that could be stuff from like bugs or glitches inside of a game that can really bog down your experience. And there are also different types of games that can have different results based on your experience with that game. Like online multiplayer games, you feel differently about that than single player games. And then there's one factor we want to really zone in on, and that's what our study is really about. We're going to focus in on single player games specifically, and the one factor we are studying in single player games is artificial intelligence and how that would essentially affect the gaming experience. All in all, it's about man versus machine. How does the machine, the artificial intelligence, really affect the player's level of engagement in a video game? Now I'm going to hand it off to Ben to go into a little more detail about artificial intelligence.
Now, artificial intelligence is the simulations of what humans consider intelligence through machines and processes. In video games, the goal of artificial intelligence is not to simulate real intelligence so much as an approximation of it. Why the illusion of intelligence? In video games, there's tighter constraints. First off, you have to run it on standard hardware. Second off, the AI has to share resources with the other elements of the game, such as graphics, music, gameplay. And third, the focus of AI is to create a fun experience rather than be real. And overall, the essential without the other essential elements, it wouldn't be a game, much less a fun game. And I'll hand it off to Eric, who will go over immersion.
There are an extensive amount of mediums out there that we can get ourselves lost into, find ourselves truly immersed in. Some of them we can go out and find of our own accord, and some of them find us. But games can be applied to the same role. And in respect to games, immersion occurs once the gamer's point of view is shifted to that of being within the game world. And everyone really has their own reason for becoming immersed within the game. Whether it's the narrative, the characters that you can, or the world, if it can become vivid for you. But all these sources tie into what is the suspension of disbelief, where you truly reject this world and allow yourself to, even if for only a short time, become part of the game in front of you. And we're working with the game to find those problem points with the artificial intelligence, with the AI, that will solve these problems that cause the experience to be somewhat abrasive and make it almost impossible to become immersed within the game itself. This also ties in with DDA, which is the dynamic difficulty adjustment of the game. I'm sure from the onset you have your standard choice of, say, medium, difficult, easy, medium, or difficult. But there's also the game itself, understanding on the inside that it may be coming after you too hard or not hard enough. It's working to find this sweet spot that allows the player to become immersed, and it's where it's not too overly difficult, it's not too easy, and just finds this nice smooth flow. Now I'm going to hand it off to Abby.
So now that we've gone over what artificial intelligence is and how it relates to player immersion, we thought all together about how there's a problem with some video games currently, how the level of player immersion is broken when you realize that the artificial intelligence controlled character acts in a way that's different than what you think they should act. So then the gaming experience is degraded. So after we thought about this, we came up with a research question and wanted to know what factors of artificial intelligence controlled characters affect the level of player immersion. And so based off this, we hypothesized that the more amount of time that an artificial intelligence controlled character spends actively participating in the game will have a positive correlation with player immersion within the game. So when we started thinking about how we're going to do this project, we decided we would make our own game with our own characters and our own artificial intelligence controlled character. And before we started anything, we wanted to make sure we had the ideal game. And so we did a bit of research and came across a study from the University of Waterloo that had a rather unique study on behavioral perception and experience within games. Most studies nowadays deal with maybe aggression related to video games or addiction, but this one simply followed gamers and asked them what kinds of things they liked within video games, such as the interface, the characters, the environment. And basically the three main things we took away from it were simple interface design that would keep it clean so you could focus more on the game, a variety of topographic features such as a realistic environment, and also challenging and desirable realistic human-like traits. So this is a screenshot from one of our games. We tried to create the environment to be realistic, keep the simple design, and so now I'll give it back to Eric, who will explain more in depth what we did with the game.
Now, from the onset, we wanted to find a genre that would be best useful, that would foster player immersion. We looked at these genres and we came up with a survival combat game. We went with a third person over the shoulder to give you the feeling of control over this character, as well as with this survival aspect, we are hoping that it allows players to somewhat humanizes them and brings out some of their baser instincts while playing the game. As well as we're giving the player a potential dichotomy that we've been working with since the conception phase, because both require their own separate needs from each other, and it's a matter of looking out for each other within the game. Also, we wanted to aesthetically portray the way that they should act. If it's a small character brandishing a rifle, he's not going to be the kind of person who's going to charge you head on, while if it's a large mechanized man standing there with his arms crossed looking like he's trying to keep you out of the bar, he's going to be the kind of person to charge you head on. We wanted to design them to look as they were going to act within the game. There is no one-size-fits-all AI, but that's by design. You make the artificial intelligence work for, you make the artificial intelligence dependent on the means that you're designing it for. Not every situation has the same solution. And what we've been working on with our study is finding these humanizing aspects that that we can find to apply to the artificial intelligence that makes them seem almost human. And honestly, that's why we test.
Well, basically, with our experiment, we had to go through 2 different phases in order to test for this correlation between immersion and artificial intelligence. So, most gaming companies, if not all, have to go through one initial phase, which is a quality assurance phase, making sure all of these game elements that are in the game are working like they should, it's functional, fixing any bugs or adding any small changes to it. So we already went through this phase a while back. Now we went into phase 2, which is our actual experiment right now. And on the next slide, I will explain more in depth on what that is. So basically, with this step, we had to give a series of surveys and interviews, and also our actual experiment. So our actual experiment, we had to videotape the participant's face, and what this will do is give us just some observations based on like how they react to certain elements within the game, or how they, or any other factors such as does the game make them look bored, and do they seem bored in the video. And we had to take into account there are many outside factors that could also go into this, such as, you know, a casual gamer would play a game differently more than compare that to a hardcore gamer. I mean, they have different experiences with the game. And basically, it was mostly a judgment call. And I'll summarize this again. We had to videotape the faces just to make our own judgment call to see like if that does, in fact, look like it affects immersion. But however, we have to quantify this, right? So before the experiment, we asked a series of questions to the participant, like just basic demographic information, such as age, gender, etc., as well as some other information, like just in general video games, like how many hours a week you would play, or how many, like the type of genre game you play, what time of day you play, etc. And we figured this could have an influence on how immersed they would be in a game, but this was outside the scope of our project for now. So after the experiment, we had to talk to the participant and ask them a series of questions based upon their experience as well. And this is the part of the experiment that was most quantifiable for us. We got our data from this part of the experiment. So we asked specifically on a scale of 1 to 10 how their experience was, with 10 being was the best experience that they've had in the game. We also had to ask difficulty, how hard was it? Scale of 1 to 10 again, with 10 being the hardest. Then there was another question where we just directly asked them how immersed they think they felt in the game. And that's also on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being the most immersed. And then ultimately we asked some other questions just for more QA purposes again, just to help us fix little bugs in the game or anything else that possibly broke the level of immersion, such as any erratic or irrational AI behavior in the game. or any bugs or glitches that they found that they felt broke their immersion, as well as any outside distractions that they had within the game while they were playing the game. More specifically, like since we were playing in a noisy area, was just talking a distraction to you? Did that break your immersion? Did any other like white noise, the sound of a vending machine or whatever, did that break your level of player immersion? So right now, I'm going to, here we go. There we go. Sorry about that. So I'm going to hand it off to Ben now to go into more depth about our results that we've gathered from our experiment.
All right, first off, we had a series of treatments when we did this study where each treatment had either high or low aggression, toughness, or flee health. And we represented aggression in this case by the rate of fire, toughness by the health. And the flee health, which was basically at what point did they flee, like how low of HP or health did they have when they flee. And then here are the general averages for the experience and difficulty and immersion based off of the different treatments. And when it starts getting more interesting when you look at from specific factors, you'll notice that there's some levels that seem to increase a significant amount, such as immersion, dependent on high flee health or low flee health, while some other things such as difficulty didn't really change much from their point of view with high flee health or low flee health. And that leads us to a couple correlations we believe that may exist, such as there being a positive correlation with immersion and through aggression and flee health, and also a positive correlation with toughness and difficulty, which seems pretty obvious that obviously the longer it takes for you to defeat an enemy, you generally consider that more difficult. And then there seems to be a negative correlation between experience and toughness. And this will possibly, obviously further study would have to be done in order to validate these results. But this would give them sort of insight into what to specifically look into. And now I'll pass it off to Abby, who'll go and summarize over what we've gone over and talk about further studies.
Great, so we discussed the problem with how artificial intelligence, if the way that it acts in a game is different from what the player perceives they should act, it breaks that level of immersion. We talked more about artificial intelligence and how it relates to player immersion. We went over our final game design and what kinds of things we researched into designing it, the environment, the characters, everything, and how we tested this game, what we believe the results will be, and now for possible future studies, we believe if we repeat the survey and get maybe a bigger, wider group of people, it could help validate the results we currently have. If we wanted to expand upon this, we could adjust some more of the factors of artificial intelligence. Currently, we just had the aggression, toughness, and flee rate. We could adjust other factors as well to see if that has anything to do with it. Or if we just wanted to break apart from our game and simply focus on player immersion, we could try testing other game genres based on the artificial intelligence still, and other factors, maybe if we still wanted to focus on player immersion but not so much artificial intelligence, we could see if adjusting graphics or interfaces would have any effect on the player immersion level. So I'll hand it back to Phil to...
All right, that basically concludes the meat and bones of this presentation, but I want to give you a little more information about us. We formed this group with this shared frustration in non-immersible AI, as well as just that simple passion of playing video games and interacting with AI in general. And we strive to try to develop a true and pure immersive experience for a gamer. I mean, that's what we all aim to do. I mean, we want them to exit the world they're currently in and enter in a game world where they can relieve some stress, or maybe, as you saw, get frustrated with it. It's all up to the player, really. And so before I end it, I want to say a special thanks to two individuals. First, Ian Hamilton, who's a programmer and application developer. He helped integrate all of our assets, and including art and programming assets, into Unity. We also want to thank Dylan Leo, who's a UI designer and a programmer, for designing our game's user interface, as well as other miscellaneous programming tasks for the game. All right, and if you ever want to get a hold of us, here's all of our contact information. And if you need more information about the project or our game, or even all of us in general, you can go to our website at syntheticalliancestudios.com. If you have a question for all of us, you can email us at syntheticalliance@gmail.com. And so we want to say thank you again for all of you coming out. We want to thank Dr. Whittinghill for coming out for us, and thank him for being our project sponsor. I want to thank Professor Burton for keeping our heads on this semester. And, well, that should do it for now. Any questions?
It seemed like you put a fairly considerable amount of effort into isolating what might have been distractions for people, like, did the code machines distract you? Did people talking distract you? Why didn't you just put them somewhere where there weren't distractions, or why allow the confounding variables to be there in the first place?
Well, we could have, but that wouldn't initially stop any other distractions from coming in. I mean, there are lots of distractions no matter where you go. I mean, there were areas we're thinking about testing, but because of certain issues we ran into, we may have to choose one place. And we wanted to ask that even in a quiet area, if we tested there, if there were any distractions that did distract them anyway, more for our sake, for protecting immersion.
So you start off with a problem statement saying that players are frustrated with AI and current shipping games, and it removes them from the experience. And you showed us your characters, and you went over the level of different AI techniques that you were going to apply, and you told us that you had these entry studies and videotaped faces while they're playing, and exit studies. Where's the game, and where's the results of those studies? Can we see the game running? Can we see your AI?
Well, we do have a working copy of the game that we use for testing. Although past this presentation, we were going to do further analysis of this of the data, and we were also going to work more on the product side. But we believe that it wasn't, I guess, as good as it could have been, I guess. And we wanted to work a little bit more afterwards on it to further polish it before we do the paper.
Okay. Can you tell us what the results of the studies were? Did the players think that your AI was more immersive than what they've experienced before? What was their level of experience in other games? What's the basis of comparison?
Well, mostly we weren't focusing so much on comparing our AI to other games specifically, but just looking at within the AI that we used, what factors affected it, affected the immersion.
Okay, so that's different than your original statement. That's how immersive can you make your own AI? Where on your website you talk about how players, you feel they're being removed from game experiences because of the level of AI in those games. So is your study you guys trying to make good AI for yourself, or are you trying to make a better AI compared to what people are used to?
Well, we're focusing more on the specific factors of the AI. So not specifically saying our AI system is better than theirs or worse than theirs, but looking at how the AI is specifically used in the game, such as we tested on like rate of fire, health, just looking at how the non-player characters in the game would affect how immersed the player is in the respect of their behavior, I guess.
Grant?
All right. I recall you saying earlier in the presentation that an AI fun should trump realism. Was that the statement that you made?
Yes, essentially that was a overall statement saying that the focus of the game is to create a fun experience. So if there's a choice between a more realistic AI in terms of like human intelligence as opposed to an AI character that's more fun to play with, that the fun would trump having a more realistic AI in that case.
I was wondering if you could expand on that. Like, is there any example in any existing game that you can bring up of where the developers deliberately made a character's behavior less realistic than it could have been otherwise in order to make the experience more fun?
One specifically I can think of is the original Halo game. They in the postmortem for the game, they noted that originally they were going to have more realistic behavior, but because of system constraints and also the ability to communicate that to the exact actions of the player, actions of the enemies to the player, they made simpler AI that wasn't as realistic, but they found that players found it more fun.
It sounded like you're saying that had partly to do with technical limitations and partly to do with making the game experience more fun?
Well, there's many factors that go into what is both realistic in terms of technology and also what the priority is for the artificial intelligence.
I'm still not completely clear on like what the more fun thing in that example would be. Like,
well, what I'm saying is that if there's two systems that they're using, or two, I guess, ways they're going about the AI, if one is more realistic from a human intelligence standpoint, and the other is less close to human intelligence, if the one that's less close to human intelligence is more fun, then that would be the one that they'd be likely to choose, because the goal of the AI in that case is to create a fun experience.
I see how fun would be the most important thing in a game. Like, I understand why that would be. I was just curious as to what exactly is more fun in an example like that where the AI is made less realistic to be more fun. Is it because it's too hard when it's too realistic?
Well, that's what we're trying to figure out in this study, is that we're looking at the different factors of the AI and how that affects both their enjoyment and immersion and such.
So I'm just kind of curious why you chose to do a 3D game. Because I feel like that would distract more of your attention away from focusing on the AI, spend more time getting the game work in the 3D environment.
I mean, obviously that would be a drawback of our study. A sort of a side focus of this project was also to create a game and use our skills that we've learned so far throughout our college career. So that might have affected our studies a bit, or our results a bit. Obviously, if there would be a further study, they might choose to do 2D instead of 3D.
You said you wanted to use your skills and whatnot to make sure you made a game, but it seemed like from your presentation that you kind of like had to call in like outside help. Why did you guys decide to make a game from scratch in Unity instead of specifically focusing on the AI and just downloading like on the Unreal Development Kit or some other kit that could have cut some corners for you guys?
Obviously, that was a drawback to our project, and if we were to go back and do the project again, we'd probably choose to do something like that. One factor that came into play was that we were, the two people that were in the project were in class with two of our members of our group, and we were combining projects in essence that in that class the focus was to create a game, and we were hoping to save time and resources by trying to combine those goals by essentially creating the game and then having the testing as essentially part of the quality assurance at the tail end of the project. But obviously that in some ways turned into a drawback.
So in your final implementation of the game, I assume that you guys didn't like get all 5 teams of like 2 that you had planned on. In the end, did you just have like the player character and one other AI entity, or?
Yes, we decided to simplify it at the tail of the project, specifically so that there'd be less, I guess, less things going on that we'd have to account for in in our study. And since we were, as I said before, we were providing projects, the game side was more on the other class side, and this, obviously, the focus was on the research. So we were.
And in your surveys, did you have any questions on how the environment affected the immersion, or was it all focused on just the AI?
Just the AI. Environment could be a whole different factor that could affect immersion, but for scope control, we want to just focus on AI, and we felt AI was probably one of the most important factors.
So if you had to like redo the project, right? If you just had like one other AI entity as just like a blank model, and then in like a blank room, would you think that would suffice for your research question?
There was a question regarding that earlier in our project, which is basically we wanted to make sure that there's at least a certain level of immersion. So that's one thing we were worried about was we wanted to both like track how immersion would lower and rise, and we wanted to make sure that we could fully see that. So for instance, when they rated the immersion, we didn't want to get a bunch of like 0s and 1s and 2s, for instance, because we feel like we wouldn't get as much data from that.
And what was the scale of your version? Was it like 1 to 7 or?
It was 1 to 10.
1 to 10, okay, and most of it was 5.
And in that respect, that actually worked out for us, is that a lot of the scores were definitely within the range. We didn't really have very many, if any, instances of there being, say, 10s or 1s.
You said that whenever they were making Halo that they didn't make the AI as realistic as they wanted to. Is that something they worked on as they were developing newer games? Because I know they made a remake of it. Did they go back and try to fix that?
When they actually remade the game, they didn't actually check or change anything about the game code. That was mostly a graphical update. I'm not entirely sure what they've done since then. I know when we were in the research portion of the project, I looked into the Halo 3 postmortem, but that was mostly about implementing squad tactics and having a leader lead a group, a different, I guess, expanding on the AI, but I didn't really read much on expanding the individual character's AI. Yeah.
In this game that you made, were the AI controlled characters all enemies, or were they all co-op partner?
They were all enemies.
Do you think that it will be valuable for a future study, if it can, like, for there to be a future study that's similar to this one, but is focused on other types of non-player characters? Like, you think that would be different enough to warrant another study? Like, would it cover different ground? Or would
Yeah.
the same principles
Yeah,
apply?
I definitely think that looking at different type of AI-controlled characters would be beneficial, because there'd be different behaviors that players would obviously exhibit, such as a friendly AI character would do different things than an enemy AI character would do.
And could future studies also look into potential types of group dynamics between AI-controlled characters also?
Yeah, definitely.
Anything else?
Was there any interaction between the AI or the enemies then in the game at all?
I guess I'm not sure if we ever noted that, but to further clarify, in this specific testing environment, we chose to just have the player and one enemy.
Oh, so just one enemy.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right, if that'll do it then. Thank you guys again. Have a great day.